Hey guys, welcome to my new mystery.
I don't usually keep a stopwatch on the front door, but if I did, it would have told me that the bell rang at precisely 6 minutes past 1 o'clock. At that time of day, in Wolfe's brownstone, the doorbell is as welcome as a mouse in the orchid rooms. Wolfe was upstairs, naturally, tending to his plants with Theodore, which meant I had the run of the office. My feet were up on my desk. The sports page was open, and I had just gotten to the part where the Yankees were explaining how they'd win next season. The bell rang again, impatient. I thought about letting it ring until the visitor decided to go disturb someone else's peace, but then I figured the sooner I answered, the sooner I could get back to baseball's excuses. The man on the stoop was the kind who'd make you wonder what went wrong with the ironing board. He was tall, lean in the unpleasant way, and wore a gray suit that didn't like him any better than he liked it. His tie was knotted like he'd lost the instructions. His eyes were jumpy, always a bad sign. "You're Archie Goodwin," he said, as if accusing me of it. "I won't deny it under oath," I told him. "And you are?" "Martin Kreitz." He gave the name like it should mean something to me. It didn't. "I need to see Wolfe. Immediately." I opened the door wider and gave him a long look. I've seen people barge in on Wolfe before, but usually they come armed with money, panic, or both. Kreitz had the panic. Money was less certain. "Look, Mr. Kreitz, there are certain immutable laws in this house. Wolfe eats at 1 o'clock sharp. He has 3 eggs, prepared just so, and he doesn't like them interrupted by business, friendship, or the end of civilization. Right now, you're standing between him and his first forkful." "I don't care," he snapped. "This can't wait. Something's gone wrong, and it's personal." That word, personal, tends to make me pay attention. Most of our clients start off pretending it's business. The ones who admit it's personal usually mean trouble with a capital T. "All right," I said, stepping aside. "Come in. But when Wolfe starts yelling about timing, I'll give him your name and your tie as evidence." I led him into the office, sat him down, and got the first whiff of what was bothering him. His hands trembled, not with fear of being caught, but with the fear of being ignored. That's the kind of fear that makes people reckless. Wolfe came down exactly 5 minutes later, lips pressed together like they were holding back an unkind remark. His bulk filled the doorway, and he lowered himself into the yellow chair with the grace of a boulder deciding where to rest. "Mr. Kreitz," he rumbled after I introduced them. "What you have to say had better be as urgent as you imagine. I'm not indulgent of interruptions." Kreitz leaned forward, swallowed, and blurted it out. "Someone switched my plate. At the Cazalet Club, and now I'm being blackmailed for what was on it." V. Wolfe didn't twitch when Kreitz dropped that little bombshell. You don't get a raised eyebrow out of the big man for less than a murder, a rare orchid theft, or Fritz using margarine. What you might get, if you're lucky, is a stillness that means he's thinking. At that moment, Wolfe's eyelids were at half-mast, his mouth settled in a frown that could have been annoyance at the man or indigestion from Fritz's last experiment with chestnuts. I tried to save the gears from grinding. "When you say someone switched your plate," I asked Kreitz, "we're not talking about a cafeteria tray with peas and potatoes, are we? You're hinting that this was a plate carrying something worth more than the average dinner check." His fingers tapped the armrest. "It was at the Cazalet Club. Last Friday evening. A private dinner. 15 people in attendance. I was served a plate that wasn't meant for me. I ate what was on it. Or rather, I looked at it. And now someone has photographs. They're threatening to ruin me." I gave him the Goodwin squint. "You're being blackmailed for what? Eating off the wrong china?" His lips tightened. "It's not as simple as that." "They never are," I assured him. Wolfe's voice came, slow and deep. "Be explicit." Look." Kreitz fumbled with his cufflinks. He wasn't cut out for nerves. The dish I received had an emblem on it. A design, small, intricate. I don't know how to describe it, but it shouldn't have been at the table. The cassoulet is discreet, very discreet. Certain guests bring certain delicate matters to dinner. The emblem was meant for someone else. I saw it, and now they say I must pay to keep quiet. He leaned forward like he expected us to gasp. We didn't. I tried again. Maybe I'm thick. Somebody slipped you a plate with a doodle on it, and now they want hush money. Why? Because, he snapped, the emblem was a cipher, a mark, a code between members, and I, by accident, received what was not intended for me. And worse, I saw it. Wolfe exhaled, which for him is close to fireworks. A cipher, he repeated, on a dinner plate. Yes, Kreitz said eagerly. Painted on the porcelain itself. A signal. And someone switched it. Deliberately. Only now, photographs have appeared. They show me with the plate, holding it, looking at it. The implication is complicity. That, Wolfe muttered, is intolerable. I wanted to clap. Wolfe had moved from annoyance to indignation, which meant Mr. Kreitz had managed to worm his way past the first barricade. But I wasn't letting the man off easy. Let's assume, I said, you're not making this up. Who was the dinner really for? Who should have gotten the secret plate? Kreitz's hands tightened. That's just it. I don't know. I wasn't supposed to know, but now I'm suspected of knowing, and worse, suspected of involvement. Involvement in what? Wolfe asked, his eyelids narrowing further. Kreitz shook his head violently. I can't. I cannot say more unless you accept my case. That got a grunt from Wolfe. He hates being put in a corner, and Kreitz had managed it without even realizing. I stood, went to my desk, and leaned on it. Look, Kreitz, either you spill the story, or you can take your problem back out to the street and see if the cops enjoy riddles as much as we do. He stiffened. No police. This must never reach them. Wolfe spread a hand, a slow dismissal. Mr. Kreitz, my time is not squandered on murky half-confessions. You're discomposed, yes, but discomposure is no substitute for candor. Either state the matter in full or remove yourself. Kreitz sat there, pale and trembling, for a long moment. Then he pulled something from his inside pocket and placed it on Wolfe's desk. It was a photograph, creased but clear enough. I picked it up before Wolfe could bother. It showed a dining table, white linen, polished silver, and Kreitz himself, caught mid-gesture, staring down at his plate. The plate had a faint design at its center, circular and intricate. To my eye, it looked like a stylized bird, wings outstretched. Not bad, I said. If I were collecting photos of dinner dates, this would be a keeper. Who snapped it? That's the blackmail, Kreitz said. His voice cracked. The envelope came yesterday morning. No signature, no demand at first, only the photograph. Then today, another envelope, $10,000, or the photographs go public, and not just to the papers, to the other members, to the club. Which would be worse? I asked. His eyes darted. Both. Either. The cassoulet is exclusive. Secrecy is its foundation. If I am tainted with espionage, or with indiscretion, my career is ruined. My life is ruined. Wolfe finally extended a hand for the photograph. I passed it over. He inspected it for a slow minute, then set it down again with distaste. Fury, he said. That meant interest. Mr. Kreitz, Wolfe continued, you understand that I accept no trifles. If you ask for my assistance, you must be prepared for interference. You must permit me to inquire, to summon, to demand. You may find my methods disagreeable. Do you submit to them? Yes, Kreitz whispered. Good. Then answer Mr. Goodwin's earlier question. Who specifically was meant to receive this plate? I don't know, he repeated. Then, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "We must discover it." At that moment, the office door opened. Fritz had appeared, holding a tray with Wolfe's eggs. He stopped short, sniffed the atmosphere, and sighed. Fritz has lived with us long enough to know when lunch is about to be ruined by business. He set the tray down without a word and retreated like a man leaving a crime scene. Wolfe eyed the eggs, then the client. His appetite warred with his irritation. Appetite won, but barely. "You will leave the photograph," Wolfe told him. "Mr. Goodwin will call on you tomorrow at 10. Provide him the names of all present at the dinner. I will review them." Kreitz nodded, stood, and hurried out with relief stamped all over his face. When the door closed, Wolfe lifted a fork, tasted a bite of egg, and growled low in his throat. "Well," I said, "there goes your digestion." "Nonsense," Wolfe muttered. "The man is a fool, but the matter is not. Someone has chosen a peculiar vehicle for communication and for extortion. Plates, indeed. The mind that conceives such devices is worth examination." I grinned. "So you're hooked." "I," he said firmly, "am inconvenienced. That is all." But I knew better. Wolfe was already rolling it around in his head, weighing possibilities. The brownstone had been disturbed, and the disturbance was going to stay. At 10 o'clock sharp the next morning, I was sitting in Martin Kreitz's East Side apartment, wondering why men with panic in their veins always choose furniture that looks like it's allergic to comfort. His living room had chairs with angles sharper than the people who sat in them, a rug that probably cost more than my yearly salary, and a wall of books that looked untouched except for the ones chosen by a decorator. Kreitz was already in a suit, the kind that wanted to be expensive but didn't quite get its wish. He fidgeted while I pulled out my notebook. "All right," I told him. "Let's have it. Who was there Friday night?" He rattled them off as if he'd rehearsed. 1. Eleanor Vardis, a society hostess, mid-40s, sharp as a tack and twice as polished. Widow of some banking man with a reputation for collecting favors like other people collect stamps. 2. Philip Denby, a lawyer with the kind of reputation that makes honest men itch. He specialized in contracts no one else could read, which usually meant he was paid not to be understood. 3. Clara Newell, an actress, young, rising, with a string of admirers and enough press clippings to paper a small country. She'd been invited as a guest of someone else, which already put her under my magnifying glass. 4. Robert Brigham, an industrialist, heavy-set, fond of cigars, and rumored to have more enemies than friends. Eindam Dr. Adrian Sorrell, a chemist, foreign-born, with a manner that Kreitz described as precise to the point of cruelty. The rest of the 15 Kreitz waved away as irrelevant. Spouses, hangers-on, minor dignitaries. But Wolfe doesn't believe in irrelevance, so I made sure to jot every name down. I closed the notebook and leaned back. "So, one of those merry diners was supposed to get the wrong plate. You intercepted it, and now someone wants 10 grand to make it look like you were the chosen pigeon. That about it?" Kreitz nodded miserably. "Fine. Now, which one of them do you think has a taste for blackmail?" "I don't know," he said, wringing his hands. "It could be any of them." "Of course it could, but it isn't. Wolfe doesn't do any of them. He does one of them, which means I'll have to start knocking on doors." And knock I did. The Vardis townhouse was the kind of place that made you wonder how much dusting it took to keep the chandeliers from drooping. Eleanor herself greeted me in a silk robe that probably cost more than Fritz's yearly grocery budget. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, purring like a cat that had cornered a canary. "Martin sent you. How quaint. Do come in." I did, and she motioned me to a seat that looked delicate enough to snap under a strong word. "I'm looking into a small matter concerning the dinner Friday night," I began. Her eyebrows arched. Small matters rarely involve Mr. Wolfe. You must forgive me if I don't believe you. Then don't, I told her cheerfully. But maybe you'll believe this. Somebody at that dinner sent out a marked plate, and somebody else is trying to make hay out of it. She laughed. Not the loud kind, but the soft, knowing sort. Oh, Archie, you mustn't imagine we're children passing notes in class. If someone used porcelain to send a message, it would be more serious than you can imagine, and more dangerous. That so? Then maybe you can imagine what it means when the wrong person got the note. Her lips curved. I can imagine. I can also imagine that you'd better be careful where you poke your nose. The Cazalet does not forgive trespassers. She wouldn't say more, but her warning came wrapped in silk and steel. Denby's office was in a tower downtown, paneled in wood so dark it made you think of funeral parlors. Denby himself looked like a hawk that had learned to smile, but only with its beak. Yes, I was at the dinner, he said, leaning back in his chair. And yes, there was some confusion. I heard about Kreitz receiving the wrong plate. But I assure you it has nothing to do with me. That's a neat assurance, I told him, but maybe too neat. His eyes narrowed. Mr. Goodwin, I make my living drafting agreements so impenetrable that no one can untangle them. Do you think I'd stoop to something as vulgar as blackmail? Sure, I said. Why not? If you can tangle a man in red tape, you can tangle him in threats. Denby chuckled, a dry sound. Perhaps. But if you're suggesting I have anything to hide, you'll need better evidence than a dinner plate. And with that, he buzzed for his secretary. Conversation over. Clara Newell. Finding Clara was easier. Her face was on every billboard and movie poster in town. Meeting her was harder. When I finally tracked her to a rehearsal hall, she was surrounded by admirers, all of them eager to tell her how wonderful she was. When I introduced myself, she gave me a smile that could have sold tickets on its own. Oh yes, she said. The dinner at the Cazalet. Such a frightfully stuffy evening. I only went because Robert Brigham insisted. He promised it would be fun. It wasn't. Did you notice anything unusual about the plates? I asked. She tilted her head. Plates? Darling, I barely noticed the food. I was too busy trying not to yawn. Still, her eyes flickered at the word plates. Not much, but enough for me to make a mental note. Brigham's office smelled of cigar smoke thick enough to choke a fire hydrant. He was behind a desk the size of a small yacht. The dinner, he barked. Yes, I was there. What about it? I told him, straight-faced, that there had been a little mix-up with the china. He slammed his fist on the desk. Damn fools, always making mountains out of ant hills. So Kreitz got the wrong dish. So what? He should have kept his mouth shut. That's what the club is for. Discretion. Maybe he's being encouraged to open his mouth, I said. Brigham glared at me. If he's too weak to keep quiet, then he deserves whatever he gets. That, I thought, was one way of looking at it. Another was that Brigham had more riding on that plate than he wanted anyone to guess. The last on my list was Dr. Sorrel, who had a laboratory uptown. He wore a white coat even when not working, which told me he enjoyed the image. His accent was faint but definite, and his manner was as sharp as a scalpel. I know nothing about plates, he said curtly, and even if I did, it would not concern you. Everything concerns me, I said, especially when my employer decides it does. He studied me as though I were a specimen under a microscope. Mr. Wolfe is clever, yes, but cleverness may not serve him here. The Cazalet is, how do you Americans say, untouchable. I left with the impression that Sorrel could hide a lot behind his precise manner, and that he didn't think much of Wolfe's chances, which made him dangerous. Back at the brownstone that evening, I gave Wolfe the rundown. He listened, eyes closed, fingers steepled, while I laid out the cast of characters. When I was done, he grunted. 5, each with capacity, each with motive. The matter requires distillation. Fine, I said. Distill away. Meanwhile, if you ask me, they're all lying through their teeth. Wolfe opened his eyes. Of course they are. That is the beginning, not the end. If Wolfe ever decided to go into business as a puppeteer, he wouldn't need strings. He'd just sit in his chair, fold his hands on his stomach, and make the rest of the world dance. That's what he did to me the morning after I'd paraded the suspects in front of him. While he pretended to be interested in a book about Byzantine history, he was actually loading me with assignments. Saul Panzer was to be on hold for later. Fred Durkin would be told to keep an ear open for gossip, and Ori Cather would only be used if the case required something slimier than average. For now, it was just me, a notebook, and Wolfe's appetite for contradictions. The first stop was Eleanor Vardis. A woman like that doesn't just live in society. She builds it, maintains it, and charges rent to anyone who wants in. Her townhouse was more polished than a jeweler's display case, and when she opened the door, she was dressed like she had a luncheon date with the Queen. She smiled just enough to be polite, but not enough to be honest. "Back again, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "So soon?" I'd have thought Mr. Wolfe's patience with me was already thin. "It is," I told her. "But fortunately, he has a lot of stomach to balance it. He sent me to clear up a couple of details." She led me into a drawing room that smelled faintly of roses and money. I asked her what she recalled about the dinner, who was seated where, and whether she had noticed Kreitz's little problem with the plate. She smiled with the patience of a hostess who's dealt with too many dull guests. She confirmed the seating arrangement, insisted she hadn't noticed anything unusual, and finally added, "Martin always overstates things. It is his weakness. He sees conspiracies in curtain folds." That was smooth, too smooth, and Wolfe would smell the polish a mile away. I left with nothing solid except the impression that Eleanor Vardis thought she was smarter than everyone else in the room. With women like her, that usually meant she was hiding something she didn't want the others to notice. Next came Philip Denby. His secretary looked at me as if I were an overdue bill, then ushered me in after a pause long enough to make me feel important. Denby was leaning back in his chair, one hand resting on a contract thick enough to serve as a doorstop. "Mr. Goodwin," he said smoothly, "I told you yesterday I knew nothing." "True," I said, sitting without asking. "But you see, Wolfe doesn't believe in nothing. He thinks everything is something even when it isn't." "So I'm back." Denby smiled faintly. "You're persistent. I admire that." He might admire it, but he didn't enjoy it. When I asked him about his connection with Brigham, he said it was professional, though the way he said it made me wonder how many favors had been signed away in those contracts. When I asked about Clara Newell, he shrugged with practiced indifference, but his eyes flicked down for just a moment too long. He claimed she was merely a pretty diversion. That could mean anything from a theater ticket to a midnight rendezvous. Wolfe would know how to weigh it. I left with Denby's cologne still stuck in my nose and Clara Newell next on my list. She was easier to approach this time in a cafe with no rehearsal crowd around her. She was sipping a cappuccino and signing autographs like a woman born to multitask. "You again," she said cheerfully when I slid into the seat across from her. "I should start charging." "You can," I said, "but it'll come out of Wolfe's budget, not mine, and he's stingier than a banker on a bad day." That got a laugh. When I pressed her about the dinner, she leaned forward conspiratorially. "Honestly, Archie, it was a bore. But yes, I noticed Martin's plate. Everyone did. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't know why, of course. But Robert Brigham muttered something about it afterward. I asked what he had muttered. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. He said, Damn fools shouldn't risk symbols at dinner. Now everyone knows. Something like that. That was gold. I played dumb, thanked her, and moved on before she realized how valuable that little nugget was. Brigham himself was harder. He had the temperament of a bulldog and the body to match. When I found him in his club, he didn't offer to shake hands, and when I asked about the dinner, he growled. Kreitz should learn to keep his eyes to himself. Maybe, I said, but someone slipped him a message meant for another party. That doesn't bother you? It doesn't concern me, he barked. And if it did, I wouldn't tell you. That was the problem with men like Brigham. They thought refusal was a shield. Wolfe would treat it as a confession. I let Brigham puff his cigar smoke into my face until I was sure he'd said everything he wasn't saying, then left before I smelled like a burning tire. The final stop was Dr. Sorel. He wasn't in his laboratory this time, but at a lecture hall, where he'd just finished talking about chemical patents to an audience that looked like it had been sentenced there. He let me corner him in the hallway, and his sharp eyes pinned me the way a hawk pins a mouse. "You persist," he said flatly. "I do," I admitted. "Wolfe insists." Sorel made a dismissive gesture. Plates, symbols, codes, all very childish. Whoever arranged such a thing is an amateur. "That may be," I said, "but amateurs can be deadly if they're not careful." He tilted his head. "And what is it you want of me?" "Your opinion," I said. "Did you notice the plate?" "I notice everything," he replied coolly. "But some things are best left unspoken." And that was all I got from him. But sometimes silence is the biggest admission. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Fritz was preparing dinner and Wolfe was in his chair with his eyes closed. I gave him the rundown, every detail from Eleanor's polished evasions to Clara's slip about Brigham, to Denby's glance when I mentioned her, and Sorel's refusal to say anything at all. Wolfe didn't open his eyes until I'd finished. "Pfui," he muttered. "They are all children. Dangerous children, perhaps, but children nonetheless." "Children or not," I said, "one of them is running a blackmail racket with a porcelain delivery system." "Not one," Wolfe corrected. "Two, at least. The author of the device and the agent of extortion. Possibly the same, possibly not. Distinction is essential." He reached for his beer, sipped, and set it down. "Mr. Goodwin, tomorrow you will locate the photographer." I raised my brows. "You mean the one who caught Kreitz with the plate?" "Sure, I'll just look in the yellow pages under blackmail discreet." Wolfe ignored the sarcasm. "Photographs do not appear without hands to take them. A dinner of 15. Guests, servants, staff. Somewhere among them, the camera was wielded. Find it." That was Wolfe for you. While I was still sorting the lies from the almost truths, he had already decided the case depended not on the plate itself, but on the eye behind the lens. And he was probably right. He usually was. I said, "Fine. Tomorrow I'll start hunting cameras. But if someone doesn't like me snooping, we might be adding bruises to the bill." Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Nonsense. You will use your wits. Bruises are optional." And that was how Section 4 of the circus ended. Me with another assignment, Wolfe with another beer, and Fritz wondering whether the chicken was roasting too fast. By the time I got back to the brownstone the following afternoon, Wolfe had settled into the kind of mood that makes Fritz take inventory of the liquor cabinet and me consider a long walk in the rain. The place had that charged stillness, like a poker game where no one has enough chips to fold, but no one dares bet. Fritz met me in the hall with a look that said Wolfe had barely grunted in acknowledgement of food all day, which meant the old boy's head was running like a printing press. I figured that was my cue to add some fresh ink. I walked into the office and dropped into the red leather chair like I owned the place. "You'll want the report," I said, making sure the words came out with enough casual swing to annoy him. Wolfe doesn't like being reminded that I sometimes bring in more than groceries. He flicked his eyes at me over the book he was pretending to read. You could state it. So I did, laying it out clean. Brogan hadn't been pleased to see me nosing around, but he hadn't shoved me down a staircase either, which meant I was still in the sweet spot between nuisance and danger. Eleanor had been brisk, careful, and just frosty enough to give me the impression she was hiding something worth melting for. And Larrabee, well, if the man had given me any more charm, I'd have had to check the lining of my pockets afterward. I ran through it all in sequence, letting Wolfe pick at the crumbs. When I finished, he closed the book but didn't set it aside. Humph. That was as generous as he got. Don't thank me all at once, I said. But for the record, every one of them has a motive big enough to need its own doorman. Bregan's sweating. Over reputation, Eleanor's guarding her father's work like it's crown jewels, and Larrabee, well, he could charm the feathers off a hawk, but I caught enough double talk to know he's nervous about something. Maybe the kind of nervous that makes a man switch plates at dinner. Wolfe breathed through his nose like a bull considering whether or not to charge. You're speculating. That's the job, I told him. Speculate, observe, and report. Your job is to sit in that chair and call me an imbecile until the right pattern emerges. He shifted his bulk forward just enough to put the book on the desk blotter. The tampering within this house disturbs me. Yeah, I said, nodding at the spice cabinet. The oregano wasn't where it should be. I checked. Fritz swears he didn't touch it. Wolfe's eyes closed. That was not a whim. Someone dared to rearrange an item in my kitchen, which, Mr. Goodwin, is sacrosanct. That affront is at least as grave as the theft of Kreitz's plans. I grinned. You're telling me the oregano is as important as the defense contracts? I'm telling you, Wolfe said slowly, that they are facets of the same intrusion. A hand that will trespass in my kitchen will trespass anywhere. That hand was in this house, and it left a message. That hit me enough to stop the grin. A message to you, to us. His eyes opened again, sharp now, to suggest that this matter involves forces not merely outside, but intent on entering, and with impudence. Well, I said, leaning back, that's one way to keep me busy. Who do you want me to tail first? He frowned. Not yet. First, we must establish control. That was Wolfe talk for bringing in the cavalry. Saul? He nodded once. That was as close to enthusiastic agreement as he got without champagne. So I phoned Saul Panzer. If you've ever wondered what it's like to work with the most competent detective for hire in New York, just imagine never having to explain twice and never worrying if the job will get done. Saul said hello. I said the word plate, and he said, I'll be over. That's efficiency. When Saul arrived an hour later, Wolfe filled him in with the barest of outlines. Kreitz's plans, a dinner switch, 3 prime suspects, and a little domestic trespass in the form of oregano sabotage. Saul didn't blink at any of it. I'll watch the girl, Saul said, meaning Eleanor. She'll be the first to move if she's scared. People guard family harder than they guard paychecks. Wolfe inclined his head. Good. Report to Mr. Goodwin, not me. That gave me something to do besides polish my shoes. I walked Saul out and gave him a couple of pointers on Eleanor's haunts, then came back to find Wolfe already leaning into the globe to pour himself a beer. That was his signal that conversation time was over. But the day wasn't done with us yet. Around 7 that evening, the bell rang, and in walked none other than Eleanor Bregan herself, all wrapped up in a grey coat with a belt cinched tight enough to prove she wasn't out for a stroll. She wasted no time. Mr. Wolfe, someone is following me. I managed not to smirk. Saul had been efficient, all right. Wolfe's brows went up. Indeed. Describe. It's a man, medium height, dark hat. He's been across the street from my apartment building since noon. I cut in with a helpful smile. Don't worry, Miss Bregan. He's the good kind of follower. She whipped around to glare at me. You put him there. Call it insurance. I said, considering the situation. Wolfe gestured her into a chair. Miss Bragan, we cannot ignore that someone tampered with Mr. Kreitz's work. You're implicated whether by design or circumstance. Mr. Panzer's surveillance is a precaution. She tightened her jaw but stayed put. After a beat, she said, then let me give you something in return. My father was approached last week by a man who wanted exclusive rights to his new project. My father refused. 2 nights later came the dinner at the club. Do you think that's coincidence? Not at all, Wolfe murmured. What was the man's name? I don't know, but he had an accent. Eastern European, maybe. That was enough to get Wolfe stroking his chin. And you did not share this earlier. I didn't think it was relevant, she shot back. I had to grin at that. Wolfe didn't like being told his cases had unimportant corners. He stared at her until the air in the room could have been cut with a butter knife. Finally, he said, thank you. That will suffice. Mr. Goodwin will see you out. Which I did, with her throwing me another glare on the way. When I came back, Wolfe was already reaching for the phone. He dialed a number I knew well. Lon Cohen at the Gazette. Yes, Wolfe said when Lon answered. I would like you to inquire quietly regarding a visitor to the Cazalet Club on Friday last. A foreigner with an accent. Find his name. He hung up without another word. I leaned against the desk. So we've got Bragan, Eleanor, Larrabee, Kreitz, and now some mystery foreigner. That's enough for a square dance. Pfui, Wolfe said. One hand moved all of this. We must identify it. That was his way of saying the heat had gone up a notch. And I'll admit, when a stranger messes with oregano in Wolfe's kitchen, I start keeping the doors locked a little tighter. When I came back in from the afternoon's field trip, I knew something was off the second I shut the front door. You don't work as Wolfe's right arm as long as I have without picking up the faintest draft of a disturbance in the house. The brownstone breathes a rhythm. Fritz moving in the kitchen with pans and knives in quiet harmony. Wolfe sighing through his chair as he wrestles with human folly, and me keeping the phone, the door, and the interruptions in their proper corral. When that rhythm skips a beat, it gets into your bones. This time, it was the office. I stepped in and spotted Wolfe in the chair, not reading, not talking, not even glancing up when I entered. He was looking at the bookshelves along the wall as if they had decided to perform a dance for him. For Wolfe, staring at a wall meant something serious. He was waiting for me to notice. I put my hat on the rack and crossed to my desk. All right, give me a clue. Did the books change order, or did one of them go for a stroll? His eyes moved at last, slow and precise, and pinned me. Mr. Goodwin, you did not touch my spice cabinet. That wasn't a question, and it sure wasn't a compliment. You mean Fritz's spice cabinet, don't you? Because if I were poking around in your drawers upstairs, you'd have already fed me to the orchids. He shut his eyes. I mean mine. That got me. Wolfe keeps a small cabinet tucked on a shelf beside the wall of dictionaries and reference works. It isn't for show. Inside are jars, some rare, some ordinary, each in exact order and labeled in Wolfe's stiff handwriting. He uses them when he lectures Fritz about a seasoning or when he wants to demonstrate that cumin does not belong in every pot on earth. That cabinet is his property, his toy, his altar. I got up and strolled over. The door was ajar. That was the first wrong note. Wolfe doesn't leave things ajar. I pulled it open. Inside were 3 neat rows of jars. Except one was missing. I turned. You're telling me this isn't your doing? I do not tamper with my own order. His voice had a deep burr to it, as though I'd accused him of fraud. Something was disturbed. Cinnamon. I leaned down, looked again. Sure enough, the cinnamon jar had vanished. The shelf showed a faint outline of dust where it should have been. Now, maybe you're thinking big deal. A jar of cinnamon walks away. Call the grocer. But for Wolfe, this wasn't theft of spice. This was trespass, a fingerprint left inside his sanctuary, and trespass in this house is like waving a torch in a dynamite shack. Any chance Fritz borrowed it? I asked. I've asked, Wolfe said, heavy with disapproval. He has not. That ruled out the kitchen, and Fritz wouldn't dream of moving a jar without announcing it, which left our guests and suspects, the cheerful club of switchers, lawyers, singers, and smug investors. I went back to my desk. That means one of them, or someone working for them, has been inside the house when they shouldn't. The door hasn't been forced. They either lifted it while sitting here, or they've got more gall than brains. Yes. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again. It is intolerable. It is a signal. A signal of what? That they feel confident enough to paw through my things under my nose, either as a message to me or as a crude search. Search for what? The obvious. Something I possess that they imagine could harm them. Or failing that, an attempt to test whether I will notice a hand laid upon me. That gave me a chill, because with Wolfe, respect for boundaries isn't about manners. It's about structure. The brownstone is fortress, temple, and machine all in one, and if someone had crept into the gears and pulled a screw, it meant we were playing a deeper game. Okay, I said. Then we've got ourselves two jobs. First, find out who got close enough to that shelf to pocket a jar without you noticing. Second, figure why cinnamon. He lifted a hand, then let it drop. It is not the cinnamon. It is the intrusion, the violation of order. Fine, but it still matters why they picked that jar. Was it just handy, or do we have some symbolic saboteur on our hands? He gave me one of his thin side glances, which in Wolfe speak means, don't test me. Saul Panzer, he said simply. That was my cue. If Wolfe was calling in Saul, we were moving past routine legwork and into the kind of chess match that needed a third piece on the board. Saul doesn't spook, doesn't miss details, and doesn't ask why until Wolfe decides to feed him the whole cake. I'll ring him, I said. Do so, and until he arrives, exercise vigilance. Whoever has dared this may dare further. I picked up the phone and dialed Saul's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady as a man waiting for a train. I told him to report to the brownstone, and he didn't waste words asking what for. When Saul agrees to move, he moves. Hanging up, I leaned back. All right, we're braced. Want to tell me what you think they were after? A spice jar isn't much of a trophy. Wolfe's lips compressed. Not tonight. First, Mr. Panzer. Then the line must be traced. We are not dealing with a bungler. That ended that. I knew better than to pry when Wolfe's shutters came down. He'd chew on it until he had a flavor he liked, then drop it on me in one of those sentences that could double as a guillotine. An hour later, Saul arrived. The look he gave me as I let him in said he knew something odd was in the air. He came into the office, nodded to Wolfe, and stood waiting. Wolfe didn't bother to get up, of course, but his head dipped slightly, which for him was like a handshake, and a cigar rolled together. Mr. Panzer, Wolfe said, an offense has been committed. Someone has removed a jar from that cabinet. Saul didn't blink. When? Within the last 24 hours. Saul went over, inspected the shelf, studied the faint dust line. He didn't comment, just gave a slow nod. Wolfe continued. Your task is to determine how, by whom, and when precisely this occurred. You will also, discreetly, observe the movements of the 5 persons Mr. Goodwin has interviewed. It is probable that one of them trespassed here, either in person or by proxy. Understood, Saul said. I filled him in on what I'd gotten from Kreitz, from Emerson, from the others, and he tucked it all away behind his calm face. When Saul left to start his run, the house went back to silence. Except it wasn't the good silence anymore. It was the kind that told me Wolfe's mind was circling something dangerous. Wolfe sat motionless, and I watched him, wondering what was brewing. A stolen spice jar might not sound like much, but in this house it was worse than finding a snake in the fridge. Whoever had done it had crossed a line, and Wolfe, for all his indolence, never forgot a line once it was crossed. Dinner came, Fritz trying to keep his usual calm while serving trout with a sauce that smelled like heaven. Wolfe ate, but I could tell his thoughts weren't on the trout, and if Nero Wolfe was letting fish pass his lips without proper reverence, that told me the case had just moved up to code red. You could tell Wolfe was annoyed without him ever saying it. For Wolfe, annoyed meant the lines around his mouth took on a tighter draw, and he leaned back with the kind of stillness that suggested a storm cloud thinking of where to strike lightning. It was Tuesday morning, and I was giving him the third rundown in as many days about the people who had been mixed up with Kreitz and his infamous dinner plate. By now, I had a notebook full of contradictions, and Wolfe had that expression he wears when he smells onions where there shouldn't be any. "Confound it, Archie," he finally muttered. "People are as careless with their words as with their food. The one betrays the other." That meant he was working something out. I leaned against the globe stand, because when Wolfe is in that zone, pacing doesn't get you anywhere. Saul says he trailed Anita Marcy last night all the way to a brownstone on East 68th. She went in at 9, didn't come out until 11. The place belongs to a lawyer named Clay Garrison. Rings any bells? Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded me as if I had just set down a spoiled truffle. "It tolls, Archie. Mr. Garrison has made himself useful as counsel to several clients I prefer not to name. The symmetry of Miss Marcy's movements grows suggestive. I had half expected him to explode with something brilliant, but no, he shut his eyes again. That meant I had more legwork ahead, and he wasn't going to budge until he had enough pieces. The bell rang, and in came Inspector Kramer with the kind of face you bring to a funeral you didn't want to attend. He gave me a glance that suggested he'd rather be talking to anyone else. "Where's your boss?" he barked. I didn't bother to answer since Wolfe was occupying half his chair in the usual way. "Present," Wolfe intoned without opening his eyes. "Sit, Mr. Kramer." "I won't sit. I just came from talking with a man who says this whole business with Kreitz is a cover for blackmail. You know anything about that?" "If I did," Wolfe replied, "would I have invited you here to be enlightened?" That started the usual growl from Kramer, but Wolfe's hand went up, imperious as a monarch. "Inspector, a plate was switched at a dinner. Since then, Mr. Kreitz has received threats in writing. You suspect blackmail. I infer sabotage with professional implications. If the distinctions elude you, I cannot help your indigestion." Kramer threw me a look that said he'd like to plant a bug in the office just to hear Wolfe's muttered insults. "You're playing this close, Wolfe. If you've got something, hand it over." "I have what you will need in due course." Wolfe opened his eyes just enough to flash irritation. "Until then, you may content yourself with your cigars and suspects." Kramer left grumbling, and Wolfe tilted his head back as if the conversation had taken less energy than peeling a grape. I knew the drill. He wasn't ready to pull the net yet, but he had just confirmed something for himself. By that evening, Saul checked in again. This time, the news was hotter. Anita Marcy had met with George Lathrop in a quiet cafe on Madison Avenue. Two suspects breaking bread together after swearing they barely knew each other. That was Wolfe's favorite kind of contradiction. Rich, layered, and begging to be eaten. The next morning, Wolfe instructed me, in that precise tone he uses when issuing royal decrees, to call each of the key players. Mr. Kreitz, Mr. Lathrop, Miss Marcy, and Mr. Garrison. Inform them they are to be present tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Promptness is not optional. Their excuses are irrelevant. If they demur, you will convey my willingness to draw Inspector Kramer's attention to their circumstances. I whistled. "So the office gathering, you're ready to roll out the red carpet." "Pa, there will be no red carpet, only the truth. Arrange it." I spent the day making those calls, which meant hearing a variety of tones. Kreitz's nervous assent, Marcy's sultry half-protest, Lathrop's oily reluctance, and Garrison's clipped legal objection. By the time I hung up on the last one, Wolfe had his lips pressed so firmly together that I thought he might crush them into dust. That night, while Fritz prepared squab with chestnut stuffing, I asked Wolfe if he was sure he wanted to herd the whole pack into our office. Because when you've got that many cats in one room, you're bound to get scratched. He leveled a gaze at me. Archie, if I waited for people to be reasonable before I exposed them, I would spend the rest of my life cultivating orchids, which, I assure you, I would prefer. Unfortunately, the world intrudes. The following afternoon, Saul came by to check in, and Wolfe used him as an audience more than anything else. He outlined the subtle alignments of motive, weaving them with enough ambiguity to keep Saul guessing. It was a way of testing the resonance of his own theory. I watched the performance, and knew then that Wolfe had the goods. He was ready to expose someone, and he was saving his thunder for 6 o'clock sharp. At 5:58, the office was rearranged for battle. Wolfe sat in his chair, lips pursed, hands resting like stone. I stationed myself with my notebook, ready to play traffic cop. When the doorbell rang, Fritz admitted Kreitz, who looked like he hadn't eaten in a week. Then came Lathrop, slick as ever, smiling too wide. Marcy arrived third, cool and poised as if this were a casting call. Last was Garrison, carrying himself like a man who thought the world should clear the sidewalk for him. They all sat, facing Wolfe like pupils before a headmaster. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, a silence so thick you could have spread it on toast. Finally, he said, "You have all been less than candid, and candor is indispensable. I propose to rectify that deficiency. Archie, lock the door." And just like that, the real show began. By the time I got back to the brownstone that evening, the air outside had gone sour with mist, and the street lamps wore halos like they were trying to get canonized. Inside, the place was steady as ever. Fritz clinking in the kitchen, Orchid safe upstairs, and Wolfe in his chair, looking like a man who hadn't moved since the Roosevelt administration. You could drop a bomb on West 35th Street, and he wouldn't stir until the debris threatened his beer. I gave him my report, and it was a long one. I laid out how Brooker had dodged my questions but sweated like he had a fever, how Miss Galt had the nerves of a cornered rabbit, and how Kreitz himself had gone from righteous indignation to whispered regret in the space of a day. I even tossed in the bit about the waitress's missing pencil stub, because Wolfe once built an entire case on less than a misplaced button. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't nod. He just let me spool it all out, fingers making their little temple under his chin. When I finished, he stayed quiet. Silence is one thing, but when Wolfe does it, you start thinking maybe he's forgotten you exist. Finally, he said, "Bring them here." That was it. Not an explanation, not even a raised eyebrow. Just those 3 words, flat as a marble slab. "You mean all of them? Kreitz, Galt, Brooker, and the rest of the dinner party. I'll need a cattle prod and a police permit." "You will manage," he said. "Arrange it for tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. Tell them Mr. Kreitz has retained me to clarify a matter which may otherwise tarnish his business and social standing. That should suffice." I tried to look like a man who didn't already feel the oncoming storm. "And if they ask why they should come?" He permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "Tell them they may stay away, but absence speaks as loudly as presence, and sometimes louder." So that was that. Archie Goodwin glorified Barker for the Wolfe Carnival of Truth. The next 24 hours were spent on the telephone and pounding pavement. Not everyone was eager to rearrange their schedule for a fat man who disliked leaving his house, but the bait worked better than I expected. Brooker showed a keen interest. Too keen, as if he wanted to prove how little he had to hide. Miss Galt gave a frosty acceptance that carried the promise of sharp glances. Kreitz himself was reluctant, then relieved. Maybe he figured that once Wolfe had them all corralled, The burden shifted off his thin shoulders. By a few minutes to 8 the next evening, the brownstone was buzzing in a way it hadn't since that time a city councilman got caught with his hand in a till, and Wolfe had decided to air the whole matter in his office. Fritz, poor man, kept giving the sideboard a protective glance, as if one of the suspects might pocket the silverware on the way out. They came in pairs and singles, awkward in the front room, uncertain of the rules of Wolfe's domain. Archie Goodwin, doorman deluxe, herded them into the office and made sure no one collapsed from the weight of the silence once Wolfe filled the doorway with his bulk. He didn't rise, of course. He didn't need to. He sat at his desk, yellow shirt sleeves straining, brown eyes half shut, hands folded across his middle like a man about to deliver a sermon on human folly. When they were all seated, Brucker stiff and straight, Miss Galt drawn tight, Kreitz twitching, and two others from that fateful dinner looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, Wolfe cleared his throat. That's all he had to do. The room hushed like school children waiting for roll call. "You wonder why I asked you here," he began, his voice heavy and unhurried. "It is because you were present when an act occurred that was more than trivial, more than social clumsiness. A plate was switched. A dish intended for one man was served to another. The motive behind that act touches on pride, ambition, and a fear of exposure. The consequences might have been ruinous, and until tonight, the truth has been muddied by evasions." He paused long enough for Brucker to squirm. "I dislike mud," Wolfe said, "so I propose to drain it." I watched their faces. That's my job, and I take it seriously. Brucker had beads of sweat forming like he was auditioning for a sauna. Miss Galt stared straight ahead, her lips tight as if bracing for impact. Kreitz fiddled with his cufflinks, the picture of a man praying someone else would take the fall. Wolfe's eyes half closed. I will not bore you with the minutiae Archie collected on my behalf. It suffices that each of you had reason to prefer one man's embarrassment over another's success. Mr. Brucker, your bid for a contract depended on undermining Kreitz's credibility. Miss Galt, your position would be compromised if certain correspondence were made public. Others among you had private grudges, but the act itself, the switch, was subtle. It required opportunity, proximity, and nerve. He leaned back, and his chair groaned in sympathy. One of you had all three. The wrong plate was served right, not by accident, not by the hand of a waiter, but by deliberate calculation. You could have cut the silence into cubes and served it with a toothpick. They were all waiting for Wolfe to put the finger on somebody, and so was I. That's the way it works. I do the legwork. Wolfe sits and thinks, and then at the climax, he does the big reveal while I try not to look surprised. But this time, he let the silence stretch until it felt like a rope tightening around the room. Finally, his gaze settled on Brucker. You, sir, lacked the proximity. Your seat was opposite. You lacked the nerve. Your sweat betrays you even now. So you are eliminated. Brucker let out a breath that rattled, as if Wolfe had just acquitted him in front of a firing squad. Miss Galt's fingers twitched on her lap. Wolfe turned to her. You, madam, had proximity. You had motive, but you lacked the required calm. You are too brittle, too easily noticed. Had you attempted it, someone would have seen. So you, too, are eliminated. Her chin lifted in defiance, but a shadow crossed her face, as though she half expected conviction and wasn't sure whether acquittal was better. And then Wolfe turned to Kreitz, who had shrunk 2 sizes since entering the room. His voice stayed even, calm as a man reading a menu. The culprit is known, he said. The question is whether I will name him now, in this room, or whether I will permit him one final chance to speak before I do. That did it. Kreitz's face went white. He opened his mouth, shut it, and opened it again like a fish that had forgotten how to breathe. The others stared, stunned. Me? I felt my stomach tighten, because Wolfe doesn't bluff in moments like this. He may tease, prod or torment, but when he gets to that sentence, the culprit is known, it's as good as a signed confession. The room went dead still, waiting for the last card to hit the table. And Wolfe, damn him, leaned back further, closed his eyes, and said nothing. The room stayed tense, as if the walls themselves were listening for Wolfe to speak, and I don't mean just a little tense. I mean that taut, snap-any-second kind of tension that makes you tap your fingers on your knees and check the clock even when there isn't one in sight. Wolfe's eyelids were still half shut, his hands folded, and that faint temple gesture of his gave nothing away. I'd seen him like this before, sure, but every time it felt like walking a tightrope over a pit. Kreitz was squirming. His cufflinks had vanished somewhere between his palms, and I was half convinced he was about to start apologizing to the furniture. Miss Galt sat straight, as if bracing for a verdict she had already rehearsed in her head a dozen times. Brooker's relief hadn't lasted. The moment Wolfe remained silent, all the old suspicions started crawling back up his spine. And the two others from that cursed dinner kept glancing at one another like they'd suddenly realized they were in a play without a script. Finally, Wolfe spoke. And of course he didn't start with the dramatic flourish you'd expect. No trumpet blares, no spotlight on the guilty party. Just a calm, deliberate voice that made the words sink like stones into a pond. "The matter is clear," he said. "Each of you present had reason to interfere, yet only one among you had the perfect alignment of opportunity, motive, and execution. A trifecta of culpability that cannot be denied." He opened his eyes just a sliver, enough to pin them to one figure. Kreitz naturally froze. I swear you could see the mental wheels turning in his head, trying to negotiate with a man who doesn't negotiate. The act, Wolfe continued, was calculated, subtle, and necessary in the mind of the perpetrator to safeguard personal pride at the expense of honesty. The switch, ladies and gentlemen, was not a matter of carelessness. It was an art. I shifted in my chair. That's Wolfe's way of warming up the audience for the reveal. He doesn't just hand it to you. He paints it slow, layer by layer, until the guilty party can't hide even if they tried. And the tension, that delicious, unyielding tension, is what he feeds on. He went over the events of that Friday night at the Cazalet Club with surgical precision. Not the boring recitation you'd expect from a police report. No, this was Wolfe's version, full of nuance. He described who sat where, who reached for which dish, the angle at which each hand moved, the timing of the servers, even the way Brooker had tried and failed to intercept the tray. Every tiny motion, every glance, every twitch that went unnoticed by normal eyes, Wolfe had seen and stored away. And yet, Wolfe said, even the most careful observation requires interpretation. Opportunity alone does not make a culprit, nor does motive. Execution reveals the artist. I had to admit, it was poetry of a sort, but it was cold and cruel, as Wolfe's revelations always are. He didn't speak of guilt to soothe. He spoke of it to expose. "And now," he said, "I name the one responsible." The silence that followed was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Kreitz's hands disappeared under the chair. Miss Galt's posture stiffened as if bracing for impact. Even Brooker leaned forward, curiosity and dread warring on his face. I, of course, sat back with my notebook ready, because there's no moment in this office more fun than hearing Wolfe deliver the knockout. "The individual who switched the plate," Wolfe said slowly, "was none other than Miss Galt." A collective intake of breath, audible even over the low creak of the floorboards. Miss Galt's eyes widened, her jaw tensing. Kreitz let out a sound that was part relief, part disbelief. Brooker raised his eyebrows, as if to ask silently, "Why her?" Miss Galt, ever composed, or trying to be, spoke first. "Mr. Wolfe, this is preposterous. You have no proof, None. Your accusations... Proof is in the act, Wolfe interrupted, calm but cutting. Observation, the timing of the tray, the movement of your hands, the way you leaned just so. Your fingerprints are not necessary here. The alignment of motive, opportunity, and execution is sufficient. I could see the tide turning in the room. Miss Galt's composure was cracking like old plaster. Her fingers twitched against her lap. Her eyes darted, searching for any ally, any escape, any hole to crawl into. Wolfe's gaze didn't shift. You, madam, acted to assert superiority, to prove that social dominance is earned not by charm, but by cunning. You considered the embarrassment of another, and you intervened. The dish was a signal, a message. You thought no one would notice. I noticed. Kreitz let out a short laugh, relieved and nervous all at once. So it wasn't me, he said. No, Wolfe said, not missing a beat. It was not you, nor was it Mr. Brucker. The others had neither motive nor courage. The culprit, it seems, was a master of subtlety, and you, Miss Galt, were the master of that night's subtlety. Her face had paled to a shade that made Wolfe's office lamps look warm. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a mute in a silent play. Finally, she said, almost a whisper, I didn't think. You did, Wolfe said, leaning forward slightly. And that is the difference. Thought without action is speculation. Thought with action becomes consequence. You acted, and now the consequence is here. For a moment, the room was suspended in something like awe. Even Kreitz, for all his relief, seemed to understand that what had happened was bigger than a social slight or a misplaced dish. Wolfe had exposed the subtle architecture of ambition, and the blueprint was unforgiving. Miss Galt looked down, shoulders tight. I suppose I should apologize, she muttered. You may, Wolfe allowed, though I warn you, apologies will not erase the observation, nor the judgment rendered by this assembly. And that, in Wolfe fashion, was it. He leaned back, half closing his eyes, letting the silence settle like dust over a table. Justice, in his office, was always precise, final, and delivered without flourish. The guilty party was revealed, the innocent exonerated, and I sat there, watching the quiet satisfaction of a case concluded without the usual fanfare of chaos outside the brownstone. Kreitz exhaled loudly, like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. Brucker's curiosity had turned to relief, and even the other two dinner guests seemed less tense. Miss Galt, the central figure of the storm, remained still, the lesson clearly seared into her mind. I scribbled a few final notes, careful not to miss any detail. Wolfe didn't care what I wrote, but I did. The choreography of guilt, the precision of observation, the way silence could speak louder than an outburst, all of it belonged in my notebook. One day, some poor fool might read it and think they understood human nature. Only Wolfe understands, and that's why this office is what it is. Fritz brought in a tray of brandy, and Wolfe accepted one glass, held it briefly, then set it down. A gesture almost casual, yet it marked the conclusion of the evening. Everyone filtered out quietly, muttering polite thanks, awkward smiles, and the occasional glance at Miss Galt that said without words, we saw it all. Once the door closed behind the last guest, Wolfe didn't speak immediately. He simply reclined, hands folded, eyes half closed, and I realized that the business of the day, of solving the case, of exposing the truth, was finished. There was no celebration, no applause, just the calm, steady heartbeat of the brownstone. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Cases like this, simple in appearance but complicated in execution, always left me drained. Wolfe, however, remained unchanged, a statue of thought and precision. And that, I reminded myself, is why he's Nero Wolfe, And I'm Archie Goodwin, chronicler of chaos, witness to genius, and forever grateful that justice, in this office, comes as silently and efficiently as the fall of night. The morning after the revelation felt like the city itself had exhaled. I don't mean just the brownstone either. New York had a way of holding its breath when secrets were in the air, and the minute Wolfe had announced Miss Galt as the orchestrator of the switch, I swear the streets outside seemed quieter, the taxis a little slower, the pigeons taking their time to flap from one ledge to another. I poured myself some coffee. Black, because some things, like Wolfe's decisions, are best digested straight, without cream or sugar. Miss Galt hadn't returned to the office yet, and I doubted she would for a while. Pride doesn't vanish overnight, especially not when it's been bruised so publicly, even in a room where discretion is supposed to reign. Kreitz, on the other hand, had called early, and his voice carried that particular mix of relief and lingering embarrassment that you can't fake over the phone. He was concerned, naturally, about what Wolfe might say if he decided to pursue the matter further. I assured him that Wolfe was satisfied, and he was. Satisfied in a way that only Nero Wolfe could be, which is to say, he was perfectly content, yet completely unreadable. Wolfe appeared in the office precisely when he intended to, moving with that deliberate, ponderous grace that always made it seem like he'd been waiting just for this moment. He didn't acknowledge the coffee I poured. He never did. He barely glanced at the morning sunlight filtering through the blinds. He sat, folded his hands, and after a beat of silence long enough to make a man sweat, he said, "The case is resolved, but resolution is rarely the end." I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe had that way of speaking that made ordinary words feel like warnings. "You mean Miss Galt?" I asked. He gave a subtle nod, slow and deliberate. Her actions revealed not just her cunning, but her perspective on human interactions. Observation is one thing. Judgment is another. She must confront her own conduct, whether or not she admits it to the rest of the world. I leaned back, considering his words. Wolfe's cases always leave me thinking. Most detectives look for bodies, fingerprints, or confessions. Wolfe looks for patterns, motives, and the faintest tremor of intention. People tend to think the criminal act is the climax. Wolfe, however, sees the aftermath as equally instructive. The ripples in the moral pond, the weight of conscience on the guilty party, that is what fascinates him. The door opened quietly, and Miss Galt entered, her movements cautious. She carried herself with a rigid dignity, though there was no disguising the tension in her shoulders or the slight flush on her cheeks. She approached Wolfe and paused, as if measuring whether it was safe to speak. Wolfe didn't look up immediately, a calculated silence that drew her words from her lips faster than she might have intended. I've thought about last night, she began, her voice tight but controlled. I understand your position, Mr. Wolfe. I accept your judgment. Wolfe inclined his head just enough to indicate acknowledgement. He didn't offer forgiveness, not that he ever did in the traditional sense. His justice is neutral, precise, and absolute. Miss Galt, I realized, was learning something fundamental, that confrontation with truth is far harsher than any punishment handed down by court or club. I decided to intervene, as I often do, bridging the silence with practicality. You understand the result, I said, but it's your next move that matters now. How you handle the aftermath of this, socially and professionally, will speak louder than anything Wolfe just said. She met my gaze briefly. I suppose I have some reflection to do, she admitted, and the words sounded sincere. Wolfe's eyes, which had been half-lidded and inscrutable, seemed to shift subtly, just enough to note the acknowledgement. That was all he needed. The rest of the morning passed with the usual rhythm of the brownstone. Fritz moving silently in the kitchen, the distant hum of the city outside, and Wolfe immersed in his routines, reading, thinking, occasionally dictating to me. I, meanwhile, scribbled notes and observed the subtle transformations in human behavior, because after a revelation like last night's, every expression, every gesture carries new significance. Kreitz called again, this time to express gratitude. Relief was clear in his voice, but there was also a lingering tension, an awareness that life had been rearranged, slightly by events beyond his control. I reminded him that Wolfe's intervention had been definitive. There was nothing more to worry about. "You've been spared more than embarrassment," I said. "You've learned who is willing to act subtly and who is merely reactive. That knowledge is worth something." He laughed, the sound hesitant but genuine. "You make it sound like a philosophical lesson," he said. "I suppose it is." Later, Brooker stopped by. His curiosity had shifted into a more reflective state. He wanted to understand, not just the mechanics of the switch, but the underlying psychology. He asked questions I hadn't expected, about human nature, the subtleties of motivation, the way Wolfe discerns character from action. I tried to answer without overstating, knowing full well that Wolfe wouldn't appreciate speculation outside of careful observation. Yet Brooker persisted, which in itself was part of the after-effect Wolfe seemed to thrive on, the stir of awareness left in the wake of revelation. Miss Galt remained in the office for a while, mostly silent, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad she had brought. I noticed she seemed less defensive, more reflective. The confrontation had forced a reckoning with herself that she couldn't ignore. Wolfe, I realized, had no interest in punishment in the conventional sense. He observed, deduced, and exposed. The internal consequences were left entirely to the individual. By afternoon, the office had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, though the tension of the previous night lingered faintly, like a shadow at the edge of vision. Wolfe reviewed his notes and moved papers around with meticulous precision. Fritz served lunch without comment, and I kept my distance, making mental notes and observing the subtle shifts in everyone's posture, gestures, and expressions. Miss Galt eventually rose to leave. She paused near the door, turned briefly, and nodded to Wolfe, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than apology. He inclined his head slightly, and she left without a word to me. The office felt lighter once she was gone, but I could sense that the impression she carried with her would linger for days, weeks even. Wolfe had done more than solve a case. He had orchestrated a subtle, inescapable lesson in human nature. After the door clicked shut, Wolfe finally spoke, his voice low but firm. The resolution of a matter is often less instructive than its observation. How people respond, how they internalize their own conduct, that is the real study. I nodded, understanding fully. "So it's not just about who did it," I said. "It's about how they deal with knowing they did it." "Precisely," Wolfe replied, reclining and folding his hands over his stomach. "The measure of character is revealed not in the act itself, but in its acknowledgement and the response that follows." The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent yet full of subtle signals, the kind Wolfe reads like a book. I sat back, reflecting on the morning's lessons, the quiet victories, the subtle human truths laid bare. In this office, there is no finality in the ordinary sense. Each case leaves an echo, a faint vibration in the consciousness of those involved, and Wolfe, as always, sits at the center, measuring, observing, waiting for the next ripple. By evening, the brownstone was quiet. Fritz had prepared dinner. Wolfe had read his newspapers and magazines, and I had finished my notes. The events of the past 24 hours had left everyone a little wiser, a little more cautious, and, for some, a little humbled. The switch, small and seemingly inconsequential, had revealed the invisible architecture of human pride, calculation, and subtle ambition. And in that quiet revelation, I saw once again why Wolfe does what he does, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the precise, unyielding observation of human nature in its purest form. I'd been expecting Wolfe to take his time, and take his time he did. The suspects were lined up in the office like misbehaving school children, each one attempting, in their own delicate way, to appear indifferent. Kreitz was fidgeting near the corner, sweating under the glare of our immovable host, and the others, including the club manager, the so-called friend who delivered the plate, and the quiet, nervous socialite, all looked like deer in headlights. Wolfe finally cleared his throat, like a small boulder shifting in a narrow canyon, and let us know it was time to begin. He didn't rise from the chair. He never does. Everything in Wolfe's method depends on his stillness, on the way a storm forms around him while he sips tea or chews on a cigar. "Mr. Kreitz," Wolfe said, "you were certain the plate you received contained information private to you, information that has since been used to threaten you?" Kreitz nodded vigorously. "Indeed. And you believe this to be a deliberate act?" Wolfe continued, eyes glinting behind half-moon spectacles. "Yes," Kreitz said. "Someone wanted to humiliate me, or extract money, or both." Wolfe paused, letting the weight of the silence settle on everyone present. That's when he started, slow and deliberate, to unravel the sequence of events, laying out the facts like chess pieces on the board. He asked each suspect to recount their movements that Friday night, the path from kitchen to table, from kitchen staff to delivery staff, and most crucially, the social circle around Kreitz during the dinner. It was subtle, nothing like the dramas you see in newspapers. No shouting, no raised voices, no gun threats. Wolfe simply asked questions, paused, watched expressions flicker, and noticed micro-expressions that would make a psychologist weep. Archie Goodwin's field reports came into play. Every movement I had followed in the city, the delivery driver's unusual route, the waitress who had pocketed the wrong plate for a moment, the club manager's sudden memory lapse. All of it converged into a lattice work Wolfe began to expose verbally. "You see," Wolfe said finally, "the crucial fact is that the switch occurred not out of malice toward Mr. Kreitz, nor from an attempt to blackmail him directly, but because one among you sought leverage for a separate dispute entirely." He fixed the club manager with a gaze that could strip varnish. "You, Mr. Harkins, were attempting to manipulate Miss Bellaby's financial interest in the upcoming gala by introducing the plate's content into a minor scandal. But you underestimated the observant eye of one Mr. Kreitz and, by extension, the investigative skills of this office." Harkins' face fell. You could see the shame pooling in his eyes. A man's carefully constructed alibi crumbled in the face of Wolfe's logic. Miss Bellaby tried to interject, to suggest there had been confusion, a simple error of human judgment, but Wolfe stopped her with a finger. "There is no error in an intentional act disguised as error. You were an accessory, knowingly or unknowingly, and that distinction, while subtle, is crucial. Every action has consequence." The delivery friend broke into a stammered explanation, but Wolfe had already anticipated it. "Your role," he said, "was the predictable one, unwitting, yet essential. Without you, the manipulation could not have succeeded. Yet you are free of moral culpability because ignorance, rare though it may be, is exculpatory in matters of law and intellect." Kreitz exhaled audibly, tension leaving him like smoke through a chimney. The entire room was suspended in Wolfe's calm, precise analysis. The pieces of the puzzle, the plate, the threat, the blackmail attempt, the personal stakes, fell into place. The mastermind was revealed, the motives laid bare, and the method as elegant and cold as a blade forged in thought rather than steel. Then Wolfe leaned back, finally, as if dismissing the tension from the room. "Justice," he said softly, "is not measured in theatrics or force. It is measured in clarity, in understanding, in the restoration of balance, and balance has been restored." Kreitz nodded, almost too relieved to speak. Everyone else looked like they had been part of a very complicated dream. And that's when Wolfe concluded, letting a final observation hang in the air. Human folly is never as dangerous as human ambition, yet ambition, when misapplied, can be as treacherous as any weapon. I scribbled notes furiously, half because I wanted to capture the genius, half because I wanted to remember that Wolfe had once again unraveled an intricate web without leaving his chair. The brownstone, for a brief moment, seemed almost sacred again. The suspects had left, some relieved, some chastened, some still trying to reconcile what had happened with their own self-image. Kreitz lingered only long enough to thank Wolfe in the most awkward but heartfelt way imaginable. Then he was gone. Silence reasserted itself like a tide reclaiming sand. Wolfe did not immediately return to his orchids. He remained in the chair, hands folded, cigar smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. I could tell he was savoring the intellectual triumph, letting every subtlety of the case settle into the archive of his mind. "Archie," he said finally, his voice even, measured, but carrying the faintest trace of satisfaction. "Prepare dinner. I'm famished, and no conversation unrelated to the menu will be entertained." I had already anticipated this. Fritz emerged from the kitchen moments later with the evening's menu. Beef medallions, buttered asparagus, and a risotto that smelled like heaven itself. Wolfe's eyes lit briefly at the sight, and he sank into his chair as if gravity itself had softened. While Fritz laid out the meal, I moved to my usual position across the table, watching Wolfe. I felt the thrill of the chase still in my veins, tempered by the quiet that follows a successful case. There is always a calm after Wolfe's storms. Calm and a subtle moral lesson you can chew on along with your food. We ate in silence at first, the only sounds being the delicate clink of silverware and the soft hum of the city outside. Then, as always, Wolfe offered a remark. Not flippant, not dramatic, but sharp in its moral precision. "Archie," he said, swallowing a bite of risotto, "it is remarkable how often human weakness is disguised as cleverness. We are quick to applaud intellect when it suits us, yet blind to the consequences of ambition. The truly dangerous are not those who err by accident, but those who calculate every move while ignoring ethics." I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "You mean the guy who switched the plate, or the guy who tried to blackmail Kreitz?" Wolfe ignored the quip. "Both and neither. The lesson applies universally." I shook my head, amused. "You're impossible sometimes, you know that?" "Impossibility is a virtue in thought," Wolfe replied. "It ensures clarity, and clarity, in the end, is justice." I chuckled, letting the tension of the day ebb out of me. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet battles waged inside a brownstone on West 35th Street. Inside, the orchids thrived. The dinner was perfect, and the world seemed, briefly, restored to its proper proportions. Wolfe finally leaned back, satisfied, and I knew the office would remain silent for at least a few hours. I allowed myself a small quip as I cleared the table. Next time, maybe the wrong plate will have dessert on it too, and I can get in on the action. Wolfe merely grunted, the closest he ever comes to amusement. The brownstone, with all its order and discipline, had endured another disturbance and, as usual, emerged intact. I poured myself a small nightcap, glanced at the city lights, and reflected that some victories aren't loud, some confrontations don't involve fists or threats, and some criminals are best undone by a man in a chair, a mind as sharp as a scalpel, and the unflappable patience of Nero Wolfe. And with that, the case was closed. The brownstone settled into its quiet rhythm again. The orchids drank their evening dew. Wolfe's appetite was sated, and I, Archie Goodwin, found myself once again grateful for being the eyes and feet of a genius who solves mysteries without ever leaving his chair. The city outside might be chaotic, full of ambition and folly, but inside these walls, intellect, precision, and moral clarity reigned supreme. Another case concluded, another wrong plate served, finally set right.